Can Trazyn and Cawl close the Great Rift? Why does Trazyn help him? Can the Infinite One capture Abaddon in a Pokeball? Welcome friends, and witness the Fall of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift. We draw on the book The Fall of Cadia by Robert Rath, and on Solemnus, Trazyn is hit by the tolling of the bell of Saint Gristal, which should be in stasis. The Tomb World there is shook to the core, and so he has to transfer his mind to another body, and after the Huntmaster, his bodyguard, pulls him to safety. Trazyn also hears of damage to his galleries. Though their closed sections have not been touched, he hears, much to his relief. The bell is a sign of danger to Trazyn, and he wants to observe this impending cataclysm. The bell itself is then thrown into the webway by Trazyn to get on the nerves of the Eldar, and he grabs exhibits to take with him. And here we learn that during the fight between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones, who drew strength from the warp, the Pylons and Cadia were made to combat the realm that gave the Old Ones their strength. Stitches to close the wound. Abaddon wanted to undo that. He currently has a black fortress left over from the many he captured during the Gothic War. It can fire a beam that is made of pure immaterium, that destroys everything in its path. Yes, basically like the Death Star. Now, with the fortress, Abaddon turns his eyes to Cadia and the ferocious warriors that defend that world. At this time, the Imperium has been able to figure out a countermeasure to the beams. The Pylons of Cadia draw on the powers of the warp, and they can be used to exhibit a calming effect so that the beam cannot damage the planet itself by boring into it. They're able to figure out this advanced technology because Trazyn, who is nearby, is observing a tech priest, and he's seeing where this tech priest goes wrong, and the tech priest goes wrong in so many places, and Trazyn badly wants to correct him. The pylons were made by his people after all, so the Infinite One watches on from his dimensional oubliette. The Magos clan was working on the anti-etheric network that would control the pylons. Trazyn secretly made small changes to correct the work of the Magos, without him noticing somehow. Trazyn, after all, was there to close the Eye of Terror, and after the Cadian pylon network is activated, Abaddon sees this, and so he knows he'll have to destroy the pylons with his ground forces. Trazyn and Cawl are both drawn to the pylons. Cawl is currently there working on the pylons. When Trazyn appears, Cawl calls him an abomination, and they get into quite a geeky debate about the word and its origin, with Trazyn mocking Cawl for using these words when he knows so many more languages, High and Low Gothic, Lingua Tethys, Binaric, and more in the Mech Cant, and Cawl says the label applies. Then Trazyn reveals that he built the array, not the Magos. Cawl had felt sure that something was going on when that man had solved the pylons before he could. Trazyn says the Necrontyr built the pylons to hold back the Eye of Terror. He was there when the pylons were installed, and that as a collector of the old and the unique, he thinks his time with Cawl will be both, and he doesn't want Abaddon to despoil the galaxy he collects from, and now he wants to show Cawl how to seal the Eye of Terror. Cawl's mapping programmatics was still uncovering functions of the pylons, beam emission points, focusing chambers, particle anomalies, that suggested these great megalithic structures had not so much been built as shaped like the Eldari did with their bone constructs, except where Wraithbone was psychically attuned, this stone's warp signature was inert. Indeed, properly calibrated, its signature was negative, like an empiric black hole. Over the last 40 hours, 2 parts of his consciousness had aligned the network to that negative polarity. Meanwhile, his third consciousness was humouring the Necron with conversation. "What I mean, dear Archmagos," said Trazyn in the 4th hour of his lecture, "is that the Imperium cannot be fully appreciated from a human perspective. It's around then a wall of the cavern collapses and chaos invades." Trazyn felt a certain regret. After all, the attack was interrupting a very stimulating conversation. Then Trazyn sees amongst the forces of chaos what he views as a specimen, Abaddon the Despoiler, a walking relic of the heresy, able to be displayed in total or disassembled for parts in Trazyn's display. He had long dreamed of adding such a figure to his Horus Heresy gallery. Seeing him, Abaddon shouts Cawl's name. Trazyn says that he will defend the Archmagos, doing it with a few odds and ends, and as promised, he unleashes the first of his odds and ends, Lieutenant Commander Cervantes of the Ultramarines, who rallies the men around him and knew the face of Abaddon. Once Ezekiel, Cervantes says, "When I drag you before the Emperor, brother, you will wish I had killed you for these crimes." They fight, and then Cawl says the pylons are starting to activate, and Trazyn unleashes a custodian to aid the forces of the Emperor. The custodian takes down a traitor dreadnought. Trazyn now is down to his last Pokeball, and says that he does not want to unleash what is inside, unless it was completely necessary, because what's inside will never stop. His bodyguard, the Huntsman, saves Cawl as a demon charges towards him on all fours. And Trazyn sees the danger of his current situation with the forces of chaos about to swamp the pylons, so he lets it out. We briefly cut to Abaddon as he finishes off the Ultramarine. His last words to the dying son of Gilliman is, "It's kinda that I slay you in your ignorance." And then emerging from the Tesseract is Katerina Greyfax, an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus. At first she sees Trazyn and says that he is an abomination. Trazyn cocks his head back to Cawl and says, "I told you the word wasn't very novel." Trazyn then explains to Greyfax where she is. She tries to fire at this abomination, but the mind shackle stops her. She then, as a second attempt, orders her Fire Eagles to kill Trazyn, and when she fails and seeing the chaos around her, she orders them to cover the Cadians, and Trazyn tells Cawl to activate the Pariah Matrix. They do, and across the cavern, the temperatures dropped. Warp beasts bellowed in horror. The air seemed full of static charge, black sparks jumping between metal objects as a dimensional push at the skin of reality occurred. Sanctioned psychers of the Cadian Eighth and sorcerers of the Black Legion, beings so completely unlike one another, apart from one crucial quality, fell in seizure as their souls were ripped out of their mortal forms and commingled as they were funneled into the warp. Snaps of arc, lightning, black as the unstarred void, lashed between the pylons around their bases, throwing sparks of dark matter where they connected other Noctilith. Those that looked too closely at the strikes saw that there were no electrical discharge but micro fissures in the air and stone, through which an elsewhere place could briefly be seen. To call it a dimension would be incorrect. The warp was a dimension, a mirror world of psychic energy where the twisted spawn of emotion and concepts played out their own mad lives. This was, if anything, the opposite of that. A place of unlife, soulless emptiness that was vast and tangible, yet did not exist in the common way of meaning at all. It was defined by what could not exist there, and what could not exist there was anything. The black streams of anti-galaxies sparked and crawled up the pylons, up out of the caverns and into the Elysian fields, to coalesce at the pylons' tips, so from afar they appeared like a field of sorcerous grave candles. Jovera Morcath, self-dubbed daughter of Abaddon the Despoiler, who is connected to the Black Fortress, saw the beam lance by the will of eternity through the bridge crystal, the anti-psychic clap of its passage resonating through the Blackstone so violently she fell in a seizure that nearly killed. Cawl sees this and says to Trazyn, "It's working, you abominable filthy genius, we've done it, we've..." And then he sees the demons were dissolving, vanishing in gouts of blue flame as they fled back to the immaterium, come apart like a shawl when a child pulls on its loose thread, melting then sizzling away like ice cubes on a hot pan. But the same fate had befallen the Legion of the Damned, who had pinned the Black Legion advance, ensuring it bogged down before reaching Creed, the Castellan of Cadia. Wraith warriors grew thin and insubstantial, their forms wavering like picked reels projected from a weak bulb, and the Saint, Cawl could see the Saint weakening. But the Black Legion, originally enhanced by the genius of the Emperor, that part of them allowed them to fight on. The Huntmaster tells Trazyn he wants to take down Abaddon, Trazyn says damage to the brain would damage his worth as a display. Trazyn orders the Hunt Master to fire at Abaddon. The shot strikes the War Master directly in the head, but it doesn't stop him. When ordered to fire again, the huntsman says another predator is stalking Abaddon. He didn't need to do it. And Saint Celestine stabs the War Master in the back, at a crucial moment, saving the life of the Lord Castellan of Cadia, Creed. And so Creed lives on for the moment, and with his injury and his life threatened, Abaddon teleports away. And there, on Cadia, they look as Abaddon comes up with another solution to destroy Cadia and end the pylons closing the Eye of Terror. His black fortress, the Will of Eternity, now a wreck, moves towards the planet and its pylons. Cawl sees indication that something had occurred when the nodal net misaligned, its null matrix failing in 6 dozen places as the pylons shifted under the microquakes running through the entire crust and mantle of Cadia. The matrix went down like a house city's power grid, parts of it snapping off whilst others continued unabated. Whole pylon sections flashed off and on again before the system became critically overtaxed and went dark. At first he thought it was an overload. That was before the seismic alarms turned his vision into a patchwork of environmental reports and crash alerts. Then he had no idea what had occurred. However, his later study of the impact zone, based on environmental effects and pics taken by the Iron Revenant, suggested that the fortress's remains were moving relatively slow when the strike occurred. Had an asteroid the size of the Will of Eternity struck at the spot travelling a standard speed of 20 miles per hour, a third of the planet would have been carved and become a new moon. Even so, the devastation was monumental, melting a crater 50 miles deep and ejecting noctilith dust and other things into the atmosphere. Large pieces of debris streaked directly into space, or arced into the atmosphere and fell hundreds of miles away. Superheated by re-entry, they ignited forest fires and touched off prairie blazes across the southern grasslands of Cadia Secundus. Trazyn, shortly after, once again appears to Cawl via pocket dimension and plans to take him with him to his tomb ship. He had, after all, been given a mandatory invitation. How kind of Trazyn. He would mind shackle Cawl and then make him his partner. He has so much knowledge. Cawl senses the shift as Trazyn appears and says he shouldn't take him. Cawl has much work to do that will increase his historical value. Trazyn should delay now and take him in a century or two. Trazyn knows what Cawl is doing. Cawl continues, saying Trazyn will lose what Cawl is going to create, completing the task the Emperor himself gave him. Should Trazyn take him, he would lose specimens beyond even the imagination of Trazyn. Cawl gave evidence, images and names only of his creations, the Primaris. He says there will be so many types not even Trazyn will be able to catch them all. Cawl then finishes, saying he was hardly involved in the War of Cadia, so wouldn't be a suitable specimen for Trazyn's museum. Cawl persuades Trazyn by saying, "You want a figure of significance, essential symbol of the battle, who embodies what happened here, one that will not be contributing any more to this galaxy. You want a man, for lack of a better term, who is Cadia." And so persuaded, Cawl is left to escape, and Trazyn captures Creed in his stead. In that moment, Creed yells. Cadia stands, firing the last of his hell pistol, while still on the world. "The 8th stand," he shouted. It was magnificent, Trazyn thought, as he drew out the Tesseract Labyrinth. What a centerpiece it would make. And then, with the death of the pylons, there is the birth of the Great Rift. As the Cadian fault widened, its gaping chasm yawning down the molten core, the void space on either side of the rupturing planet began to tear and abrade. Empiric energy poured through the void, spilling from a fracture that started in the sundered pylon fields of Cadia and extended impossibly into the emptiness beyond. A seismic fault in the skin of the universe, a fissure in real space that stretched on and on into the dark heart of the Imperium. This, of course, friends, is the Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, that from this point in history, going forward, will split the Emperor's Imperium into 2 halves. And on that dark note, friends, we'll wrap up today's video. I really enjoyed, as usual, the interactions between Cawl and Trazyn. As a collector of comic books and books, I hasten to add, and not specimens from my collection. I kind of understand where Trazyn is coming from sometimes, and him and Cawl have a good rapport, to the point where you almost want to see them working together. And much like Robert Rath's other book, The Infinite and the Divine, this book really grabbed me. I'm not only a fan of the Astra Militarum, but I did enjoy their role in this as we see Cadia fall. Creed was also another great character. And friends, let's wrap things